The dog barked, sharp and unrelenting, facing the trees where fog hugged the ground like smoke from an invisible fire. Landon didn't move. He stood behind Bear, one hand gripping the rusted knife he'd found beneath the collapsed woodpile 2 days ago. The other trembled slightly in the cold. The cabin behind them groaned with wind. The roof sagged like tired shoulders. Gaps in the walls let the mountain air pour in uninvited. The floor creaked and smelled of mildew and mouse droppings. Nothing about this place was safe, but Bear barked like something worse than rot was out there, something invisible, something true. Landon scanned the woods, eyes darting between tree trunks, but he saw only mist. The last of the afternoon light was slipping fast, taking warmth with it. He pressed closer to Bear's side. "Do you see something?" he whispered. Bear didn't look back. His ears were stiff, tail low and tense. He didn't bark for attention. Never had. When he barked, something was always off. That night in Roanoke, he barked moments before the drunk man came stumbling out behind the bus stop. Another time, it was a copperhead under the old tarp they used as shelter. Bear didn't make noise unless noise mattered. But now, nothing moved. Landon took a step forward, peering past Bear's rigid frame. The trees stared back, unmoving. He lowered the knife just a little. "Maybe it's nothing," he murmured. Bear growled low in his throat. Not warning. Not fear. It sounded like protest, like, "No, kid, it's not nothing." Landon's stomach clenched. "All right," he said, steadying his breath. "We'll keep watch." They didn't sleep that first night. Not really. Landon had found the cabin just 3 days earlier, after nearly 2 years on foot. 2 years of back roads and sleeping in drainage tunnels, avoiding every set of adult eyes. Bear had been with him since the 2nd week, found him behind a dumpster in Virginia, when Landon had barely managed to protect a ham sandwich from raccoons. The dog had looked like a ghost, thin, skittish, one ear shredded like an old flag. But he'd sat down 2 feet away and hadn't left since. They had made it here, this forgotten patch of the Appalachians, guided by nothing but trucker gossip, Bear's nose, and Landon's hope that maybe, just maybe, no one would ever come looking. That night, Landon tucked the dog in close. Bear didn't sleep, just watched the window, chest rising and falling slow and steady, like a machine at half power. At one point, Landon drifted off. Then the sound came again. 3 sharp barks. Same direction, same warning. He jolted up. "What is it now?" he whispered. Bear was on his feet already, nose at the door crack, tail stiff. Landon crossed the room. The fire in the makeshift hearth had died, leaving only embers. He pushed the door open an inch. Silence. But something had changed. The scent. It was faint, but it was there. Not rot, not animal. Something more chemical. Landon sniffed again. Gasoline. He looked down at Bear. The dog's nose twitched rapidly. Then Bear turned and headed for the back wall, the one with the floorboards Landon hadn't yet explored. "What?" he asked. "It's coming from inside." Bear stared at the ground, gave one short, decisive bark, then pawed the floor. Landon grabbed the cold lantern, lit it with one of his last matches, and crouched. He brushed aside broken plaster, soot, and years of dirt. The plank Bear pawed was loose. He wedged the knife beneath it and pried. Underneath was a hollow. Not deep, but enough. He pulled out an old tin, flat, rectangular metal handle broken on one side. Inside were 2 things: a mouldy book with water-stained pages and a child's shoe. His breath caught. The shoe was small, way smaller than his. Pink once, with a faded daisy on the side. Dried mud still clung to the sole. He held it up to Bear. The dog sniffed, growled. Landon stared into the hollow again. The smell of gasoline was stronger here. The book had stuck pages. He peeled one open with shaking fingers. The handwriting was sloppy, rushed, some words smudged. He read aloud. They said no one would ever find this place, but if you did, please don't let it happen again. The ink stopped there. He stared at the page, then back at Bear. Someone was here before us. The dog gave a low, almost imperceptible whine. And they didn't leave? Not really. Landon looked around the cabin with new eyes. Suddenly the corners looked deeper, the silence heavier. This wasn't just shelter. This was a secret. And Bear had barked at it. At the truth. Landon stood slowly, closing the box, tucking it back where he found it. They'd need to find out more, but not tonight. Tonight he would stack wood at every wall. Tonight he would let Bear sleep with his back to the door. Because whatever had been here before them, whoever, it hadn't really left. And Bear had known first. Always did. Morning came thin and pale, crawling across the cracked window panes of the cabin. Landon woke to the sound of Bear's breathing, a slow, steady rhythm that had become more familiar to him than his own. For a moment he forgot where he was. The mountain air carried a scent of pine, smoke, and something colder beneath it. Then the ache in his stomach returned, pulling him back to reality. Hunger was always the first thing he felt each day. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and watched Bear nose through a pile of old tin cans in the corner. The dog's fur, once matted, now glinted slightly in the sunlight that slipped through the broken boards. His left ear, torn and folded, gave him a permanent look of suspicion, even when he was calm. "Nothing good in there, buddy," Landon said quietly. Bear ignored him for a moment, then turned and dropped a mouse at Landon's feet. The boy wrinkled his nose. "You're proud of that, huh?" Bear's tail gave a single thump. Landon smiled despite the hunger clawing his ribs. "All right, you win, you hunt. I'll figure out the rest." He reached for the metal pot they'd found yesterday, still half covered in rust. He carried it outside, filled it at the creek, and set it over a small fire. The cabin sat on a slope that caught sunlight only a few hours each day, and the stream below was their lifeline. He had built a small filter from an old t-shirt, sand, and gravel, a trick he'd learned from a trucker 2 summers ago. The man had given him a sandwich and told him, "If you can clean water, you can live anywhere." Landon had never forgotten that. Bear followed him to the edge of the clearing, nose twitching in the wind. The world here felt endless. Peaks rolling into each other, forests dense enough to swallow sound. For 2 years, this had been his pattern. Wake up, survive, move on. But something about this mountain made him want to stay. He watched Bear wander toward a stump, sniffing at claw marks on its side. The dog's movements were precise, almost tactical. Landon remembered the first time he saw him. Behind a grocery store in Roanoke, the night everything went wrong. He'd been digging through a dumpster for bruised fruit when a sharp bark made him freeze. A big man in an apron came out shouting, swinging a broom. Landon ducked behind the bins, heart hammering. The man wasn't yelling at him. He was chasing a dog, thin, filthy, limping on one leg. The man threw something, a rock maybe, and the dog yelped. Landon didn't think. He stepped out, grabbed a loaf of stale bread from the bin and whistled. "Here, boy." The man turned on him, eyes wild. "You little thief! That's not your dog!" "I know," Landon had said. "He just looks hungrier than me." He threw the bread toward the dog. It landed between them. The dog hesitated, then bolted, not toward the food, but toward Landon. He'd expected teeth. Instead, the dog pressed against his legs, trembling. The man cursed and went back inside. Landon crouched down, touched the dog's neck. No collar, No tag, only a long scar across the shoulder and that torn ear. "You're broken too," Landon had whispered. That was the night Bear started following him. No leash, no command, no promise. Just two beings that the world had decided were disposable. Now, in the mountain light, Bear looked older but stronger. The scars had faded, replaced by layers of muscle from endless walking and hunting. Landon looked at him and saw not a stray, but a survivor. He took a deep breath, feeling the air sting his lungs. "We made it, Bear. I don't know what this place is, but it's ours now." Bear didn't look up. His nose was buried in the dirt near the cabin steps. He started pawing. "Again?" Landon muttered. "What now?" Bear pawed harder, then stopped and let out a short bark. Landon sighed, stood, and knelt beside him. There was something glinting faintly beneath the soil, a small, round piece of metal. He brushed away dirt until he could see it clearly. It was a coin, not new, rusted on the edges, but the face on it wasn't American. The inscription was in another language, something like Cyrillic. Landon frowned. Where did this come from? Bear only tilted his head. He slipped the coin into his pocket. Guess we've got neighbors from far away. That night, the wind rose again. The cabin moaned, wood shifting like old bones. Landon built a better fire this time, stacking the wood Bear had dragged in from the edge of the forest. They sat together in the flickering orange light. Bear's head rested on Landon's knee. "You ever wonder why we're still here?" the boy whispered. "Out of all the bad luck in the world, we get to keep going." Bear blinked slowly, the kind of look that wasn't quite human, but understood more than words could. Landon leaned back against the wall. The air smelled of pine sap and wet ash. He stared into the fire and let himself remember things he usually buried, the face of his mother driving away, the silence afterward, the nights hiding from thunder and strangers. He remembered how, before Bear, he used to talk to no one. How quiet used to mean danger. Now quiet just meant Bear was listening. He reached down and ran his hand along the dog's back, feeling the rough patches where fur refused to grow back. The heartbeat beneath his palm was steady, grounding. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped. Both of them froze. Bear lifted his head, ears pricked. Landon whispered, "It's just the wind." But Bear didn't relax. He rose silently and moved to the window, tail low, muscles tight. Landon's stomach turned cold. The wind died. The forest was still. Too still. Bear's growl rumbled again, quiet but certain. Landon grabbed the lantern and held it near the window. For a second, the light caught something moving between the trees, a flicker, like reflection on glass. Then it was gone. "Bear?" The dog turned his head, eyes fixed on that same patch of woods as last night. Landon set the lantern down slowly. "All right," he whispered. "We'll watch again." They stayed there for hours, shoulder to fur, eyes on the dark. Whatever had happened here before, whoever left the bones and the book, wasn't finished yet. And somehow, Landon knew, Bear had been broken long before they met. But maybe that's what made him perfect for this place. Broken things, after all, had a way of finding each other. The forest had a sound to it, even when it wasn't speaking. Leaves rustled like whispers behind closed doors. Branches clicked together like old bones, trading secrets only they could understand. But lately, something about the sound had changed. Bear was the first to notice. It started with the wind. Every time it blew from the north, he'd rise from his usual spot by the stove and face the cabin wall. His body would stiffen. His eyes would fix on something Landon couldn't see. Sometimes he'd let out a soft, warning growl, low and steady, like a warning given more for ritual than fear. Wind's just wind, Landon muttered once, when Bear had spent 10 minutes locked on that same spot. But the dog didn't flinch. Over the next few days, Bear's behavior grew stranger. He refused to eat one morning, just sniffed his bowl and walked away, circling the cabin instead. At night, he stood watch at the door for hours, ears twitching, tail low, every muscle on edge. At first, Landon chalked it up to age. Bear wasn't young anymore. Maybe his ears were playing tricks, or he'd picked up the scent of a raccoon or fox. The mountains had plenty of ghosts, most of them harmless. But when Bear started sniffing the kitchen floor, something shifted. He'd pace the area near the stove, nose pressed to the wood, whimpering. Then he'd dig. Not frantic digging, like he'd chase a squirrel underground, but careful, measured scrapes, like he knew exactly where to go. "Quit that," Landon said one afternoon, trying to laugh it off. "You're going to ruin the whole damn floor." But Bear didn't stop. That night, the wind returned. Not violent, just constant. It pressed against the boards, curled through the cracks, moaning in the stovepipe. Bear stood again at the door, then moved toward the back corner. His growl this time was different, sharper, urgent. Landon turned down the flame, letting the cabin fall into a low orange glow. He watched Bear. The dog paced in a slow arc, then stopped dead in the center of the room. He looked at Landon. Not a glance, not curiosity, a look. "What?" Landon said, heart beginning to race. Bear turned, walked straight to the stove, and began pawing at the floor again. All right, Landon muttered, standing. "Fine, you win." He grabbed the small hatchet they used for firewood and knelt beside the stove. Bear stepped back, but didn't move far. He sat, eyes fixed on Landon, waiting. The first layer of floorboards came up easy, rotten near the edges, splintered from time. Dust billowed. Something underneath glinted in the light. Landon leaned in. What he saw didn't register at first. Just a pale curve, like driftwood. He brushed at it with his fingers. It wasn't wood. His hand froze. He looked up. Bear hadn't moved. Landon reached into the hole and pulled gently. A shard came loose. Bone. Dirty, dry, and unmistakably shaped like part of a human forearm. He dropped it with a gasp. His breath caught. The floor around him suddenly felt too thin, the walls too close. "Oh my God," he whispered. Bear rose and stepped beside him, nose brushing the exposed dirt. He didn't growl this time. He just sat. Landon stared at the bone. It wasn't just old. It had been here, buried beneath their feet the whole time. He stood quickly, almost stumbling backward. "This can't be real," he said. It could be an animal." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. That shape, that joint. It wasn't a deer or a fox. He backed away, heart hammering. Bear didn't move, just watched him. "What happened here?" Landon whispered. His mind raced. Who buried a body under a cabin floor? When? Why? The cabin had been abandoned for years. Was this someone who'd lived here before? Someone no one came looking for? Landon looked down at the small shard of bone lying near the wood stove. The room felt colder, the fire dimmer. The wind outside picked up again, brushing the walls with long, icy fingers. Bear walked to Landon and leaned into his side, not nudging, not asking, just there. Landon placed his hand on Bear's back. "I should have listened," he said. The next morning, Landon dug deeper, quietly, carefully. The hole beneath the stove grew wider, revealing more bones. A partial ribcage, a fragment of skull. He reburied them for now, wrapping each in old rags before lowering them back into the dirt, not to hide them, but to show respect. That night, Bear lay beside the door, silent, calm. The wind had changed direction. But Landon no longer believed it was just the wind. Something had happened in this cabin long ago, something Bear could smell even when the rest of the world forgot. And now that he knew, Landon couldn't forget either. He didn't know who the bones belonged to, or what had brought them to this mountain. But one thing was clear. Bear had seen the truth first, and Landon would never doubt him again. For 3 nights, Landon couldn't close his eyes. Every time he did, he saw the hollow beneath the stove, the dry bones curled like a secret never meant to be found. The shadows in the cabin moved differently now. Every creak in the floor sounded like someone pacing just out of sight. Bear stayed close the first night after the discovery, lying at the door, head up, alert. But Landon couldn't stand the way the dog kept staring towards the stove. It was as if Bear still saw something there, something unfinished. By the second night, Landon snapped. "Stop it," he said. "It's done." Bear looked at him, tail still, eyes steady. "I said stop!" He picked up one of the smaller bones he hadn't been able to rebury, something that looked like part of a hand, and threw it into the fire. The flame hissed, spat, then roared higher. The smell of burnt marrow filled the air, thick and sour. Bear barked once, sharp and furious. Landon turned. "Enough!" he shouted. "Just be a dog, damn it! Stop acting like you know everything!" The words hung in the air, louder than the wind outside. Bear stood there for a moment, his chest rising and falling, then turned and pushed through the door, disappearing into the dark. The silence that followed was worse than the barking. Landon sank onto the floor, the firelight painting the walls in shades of red. He wanted to call the dog back, to take the words back, but pride and fear glued him to the spot. He told himself it was fine, that Bear would come back when he was hungry, that this place, this mountain, didn't belong to ghosts or old bones. It belonged to them. But when morning came, Bear was still gone. The forest looked emptier without him. Landon searched along the creek, through the thickets where they'd hunted rabbits. He found tracks at first, large paw prints in the mud, but they vanished by the ridge, swallowed by the rain. He called out until his voice cracked. "Bear, come on, boy, I didn't mean it!" Only the echo answered back, bouncing through the trees. By midday, the rain turned to sleet. Landon made his way back to the cabin, soaked, shaking, his throat raw. He built a fire, but the warmth didn't reach him. The room felt bigger now, emptier. He stared at the door, waiting for that familiar silhouette to appear. It didn't. He tried to eat but couldn't. The silence pressed down on him. Every sound outside, a branch breaking, a gust of wind, sent his heart racing. That night, as he lay awake, something scraped across the roof. Not an animal, too heavy. The sound crawled slowly from one end of the cabin to the other. Landon gripped the knife under his blanket. He whispered, "Bear." Nothing. The sound stopped. He waited. Then, faintly from the woods beyond the window, came a bark. Landon froze. It wasn't close. It wasn't panicked. Just one bark, long, steady, and distant. He jumped up, heart hammering, ran to the door, and flung it open. Cold air rushed in. The moonlight lit the snow-dusted ground. "Bear!" he called. "Where are you?" No answer. He stepped out barefoot, breath steaming, scanning the tree line. The forest whispered, but not a leaf moved. The silence swallowed him again. He went back inside, shutting the door hard. The lock rattled. The cabin groaned. Landon dropped to the floor beside the fire and pulled the blanket tight around his shoulders. The guilt gnawed deeper than the cold. He remembered the first time Bear had saved him, the night in the junkyard, when those 2 men tried to chase him off for stealing copper wire. Bear had come out of nowhere, barking and snapping until they ran. That dog had never left his side since, never once betrayed him, and he'd just thrown that away with 6 angry words. "Stop it! Just be a dog!" By dawn, the fire had died out. Landon sat watching the smoke curl through the cracks in the ceiling. He hadn't slept at all. He walked to the door and opened it again, half hoping Bear would be sitting there, tail thumping against the porch, like nothing happened. The snow outside was clean. Untouched, he stepped out, scanning the ridge. A crow called somewhere above the trees. He whispered, "I'm sorry." The wind carried his voice away. Inside, the cabin felt colder than ever. The burned spot in the fire pit still smelled faintly of charred bone. Landon knelt by it, staring at the ashes. "I shouldn't have done that," he said aloud. "I shouldn't have burned it." The words came out cracked, small. He picked up the shovel and went back to the spot under the stove. He scraped the dirt until his hands were raw, then buried the ashes where the bones had been. "Rest," he whispered. Then quieter, "Please come back." That night, he didn't light a fire. He didn't eat. He sat by the window, waiting. The forest was silent again. Too silent. When the first light of morning crept through the cracks, Landon heard it. The faint crunch of snow outside the door. He held his breath. Then, softly, a whine. He opened the door. Bear stood there, covered in snow, one paw bleeding, eyes tired but calm. Landon dropped to his knees. "I'm sorry," he said, voice shaking. "You were right. You always are." Bear stepped forward and pressed his head against Landon's chest. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, and for the first time in days, breathed without fear. The mountain was still. The wind eased. But something inside the cabin had shifted forever. They both knew it now. Whatever secret this place was hiding, it had no intention of staying buried. Bear didn't let Landon sleep that night. The dog paced from the door to the back wall of the cabin, then back again, whimpering low in his throat. His tail stayed rigid, ears tilted not toward the forest, but to the floor, as if he were listening to something Landon couldn't hear. "Come on," Landon whispered, still groggy. "We just got you back, Bear. Can we please just sleep?" But Bear barked once, short, sharp, then turned and padded toward the rear of the cabin, looking over his shoulder. Landon groaned and sat up. "You better not be chasing shadows again." Outside, the frost had hardened into a crust across the ground, crunching under his boots. Bear didn't wait. He trotted straight for the slope behind the cabin, the one covered in moss and half-buried pine needles. "Bear!" Landon called after him, trying to keep up. "It's cold. If you're dragging me out here for a squirrel, I swear." But Bear wasn't chasing squirrels. He stopped at a spot Landon had never paid much attention to. A broad, flat stone pressed into the earth, almost like it had been laid there deliberately. One corner jutted up, just barely, enough to catch Bear's attention. The dog began digging furiously, his paws sending dirt and wet leaves flying. "Easy, you'll tear your nails up again." Landon muttered, crouching beside him. He ran his hand along the stone, cold, smooth, not natural, not like the others scattered across the hillside. Bear stopped digging and stepped back, panting, watching Landon expectantly. The boy slid his fingers under the raised edge. It resisted. He wedged his rusted knife underneath and leaned his weight in, grunting. The rock shifted with a dull groan. A puff of stale, metallic air escaped from underneath. Landon pulled back. "What the hell is that?" He whispered. Beneath the stone was a hole, square, lined with rotted wood planks and the remains of rusted nails. A hatch, a door to something below. Bear let out a low whine. Landon hesitated. Everything in him screamed to close it back up. But then he saw the hook, still bolted to the underside of the stone slab, as if someone had once opened this regularly. With shaking hands, he dug more of the dirt away, enough to expose an old metal ring. He yanked. The hatch creaked open fully, revealing a wooden ladder descending into pitch black. Nope, Landon muttered, backing away. Bear didn't move. He sat at the edge of the opening, eyes fixed on Landon. The air down there smelled like mold, rust, and something faintly sweet. Like rot. Landon swallowed hard. "This is stupid," he said. "Stupid and dangerous." But Bear stayed still. Landon grabbed a flashlight from the cabin and returned, heart pounding. He shined it into the hole. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing dirt walls, a few shelves, and what looked like cans? Food. Old food. Cautiously he climbed down. The wooden ladder groaned under his weight, but held. When his feet hit the packed earth floor, the air felt heavier, like it had been waiting. The beam of his flashlight flicked over the walls, lined with shelves of rusted canned goods, a folding cot, a dented water jug, and something that made his skin go cold. A handprint, dried, red, stained onto the inside of the door. He turned slowly. There was more. In the far corner sat a wooden crate. Inside it, a mess of old clothes, a tattered wool blanket, and a leather-bound notebook. Next to it, a Polaroid photograph, yellowed with time. A man and a woman, both smiling, arms wrapped around each other in front of what looked like the very same cabin. But someone had written on the bottom in red marker, the letters smudged but legible. They thought no one would ever come this far. Landon stared. His chest tightened. He opened the notebook. Page after page of neat cursive, days marked, rations noted, entries like, Day 12, heard the engine again. We stayed quiet. Day 18, snow falling harder, can't leave, he says it's not safe. Day 23, something's wrong. I think we're not alone. The last page had just 3 words, scrawled in shaky handwriting. He locked it. Landon shut the notebook. The flashlight flickered. Time to go, he whispered. He scrambled back up the ladder, heart pounding like a war drum. Bear was waiting at the top, tail twitching, but eyes calm, as if he'd known what was down there all along. Back inside the cabin, Landon shoved the stone back into place, breath ragged. He sat beside the fire, the photograph clenched in one hand, the notebook in the other. That wasn't a storage room, he muttered. Bear curled beside him, resting his head on Landon's boot. It was a prison. Silence stretched between them. Then Landon said it out loud, the words forming like frost on glass. Someone was kept here. Maybe more than one. He looked down at Bear. And you knew. You knew something was wrong from the start. The fire cracked. The shadows shifted. And Landon realized he and Bear weren't just surviving anymore. They were unearthing something someone had tried very hard to bury. By morning, frost clung to the cabin's windows like lace. Landon barely noticed. He sat at the table with the photo and notebook from the hidden room in front of him, eyes puffy from lack of sleep. Bear dozed beside the wood stove, legs twitching gently in a dream. Landon didn't touch the firewood pile. Instead, he sat in silence, replaying every bark, every growl, every ignored warning Bear had offered in the last few weeks. The image of the stained handprint wouldn't leave his mind. You were right, Landon whispered at last, voice raw. You were right the whole time. Bear's tail thumped once against the floor. That day, Landon returned to the hidden room. This time, he came prepared. Gloves, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a small pouch slung over his shoulder. He didn't feel the same fear as before. Not exactly. It was still there, humming just under his skin, but it was now focused, driven by something else. Purpose. The air down there still smelled like mold and time, but in the light, it seemed less like a tomb and more like a secret waiting to be decoded. Landon began sorting through the cans. Most were rusted shut or puffed out from age, but a few remained intact. Labels faded, but readable. He opened a side panel on the far wall with his pocket knife. Behind it, insulation pulled back to reveal a bundle wrapped in wax paper. Inside, wire. Several yards of it, coiled and surprisingly clean. He blinked. Bear had stayed at the top of the ladder but let out a short bark. I know, I'm coming." Later, by the fire, Landon set the wire and the salvaged cans on the table. He stared at them, thinking. "I guess it's not just old food," he muttered. "It's clues. Someone lived here long enough to prepare for something." Bear licked a paw and glanced toward the door. "You want to go out?" Landon asked. But Bear didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he padded toward the side of the cabin, toward the far wall. He stopped, sat, and stared at a section near the floor. Landon crouched next to him. "Another rock," he murmured. He knocked lightly along the wooden planks until his fingers met something that echoed different. Hollow. With a little prying, the plank shifted to reveal a shallow cavity. Inside, a pair of shears, a rusted screwdriver, a roll of old cloth, and something else, a folded page, brittle from age. Landon unfolded it carefully, heart hammering. The handwriting was the same as the journal, only this wasn't a diary entry, it was a letter. "Dearest Thomas, if this reaches you, it means I've gone. They said it would be temporary, just until we were cleared, but days have turned into weeks. I think someone was watching us, not from the outside, from below. I heard noises last night. If you make it back here, don't stay. Please don't stay. A." Landon stared at the letter until the lines blurred. There'd been someone else here, maybe more than one person. Someone scared enough to write a letter they didn't get to send. Someone who thought they were being watched. From below. He looked at Bear. The dog sat perfectly still, waiting. "Why do I feel like this place has more to say?" Landon asked. Bear gave a low whuff and trotted toward the door. Then he turned, looked back, and waited. Landon followed. It wasn't a grand search, no gadgets, no underground tunnels with spy-level secrets. Just Bear sniffing the ground, pawing at old roots, stopping now and again to dig. Landon carried a small spade. Each time Bear barked or whined, he marked the spot on a map he'd started sketching on the back of an old cereal box. Behind the woodshed, Bear scratched at the dirt until his paws bled. Landon took over. 6 inches down, his fingers hit metal, a toolbox, eaten by rust, but intact. Inside, more wire, nails, a headlamp with dead batteries, and a tin labeled bait. Another time, Bear led him to a corner of the garden that Landon hadn't dared to till. Beneath a buried stone, he found a hunting knife still wrapped in oilcloth, the blade sharp as the day it was packed away. "These people were ready," Landon whispered, "for something." By the end of the week, the cabin's table was littered with salvaged tools, repaired hinges, and coiled wire drying near the stove. Landon had used the intact supplies to patch the back wall. The tarp over the roof was replaced with nailed-down boards. The broken stairs to the loft were reinforced. Slowly, the cabin was becoming more than shelter. It was becoming fortified. Bear, always at his side, seemed to know what needed doing before Landon said it out loud. When a loose shutter banged in the night, Bear growled before it even moved. When a storm broke through the mountains, Bear curled against the weak spot in the doorframe, teeth bared, like he was guarding it from more than wind. Landon's voice no longer held anger when he spoke to him. Instead, it carried gratitude. "Thanks, buddy," he said one night, handing Bear a strip of jerky from the last hunt. "For staying, even when I didn't deserve it." Bear blinked slowly, then laid his head on Landon's lap. They didn't talk about the bones, or the letter, or the sound Landon had heard once under the floor late at night, like movement. They didn't need to. Some truths didn't have to be solved to be respected. They just had to be survived. And for that, Landon was finally learning. It helped to have someone who listened not with words, but with every part of themselves, just like Bear. The first snowfall had come heavy and wet, blanketing the forest in hushed white. Landon stood on the porch, sharpening a blade he'd used to carve fence posts. The cabin creaked gently behind him, warm smoke curling from the chimney. Bear lay a few feet away, his coat dappled with snowflakes, ears alert, even in rest. They'd built something here. Not just shelter, but safety. A rhythm. A kind of peace. That's why the sound of boots crunching in the snow stopped Landon cold. Bear was on his feet before Landon was. No growl, no bark, just stillness. Pure tension, his tail low, his gaze locked down the trail leading in from the north, a trail few even knew existed. A figure emerged from the trees, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dull green jacket with a patch that read, Forest Service. His beard was well kept. His snowshoes creaked as he approached the clearing, scanning the cabin like he was taking inventory. "Afternoon," the man called. His voice was deep and practiced, the kind meant to sound casual. "Didn't mean to startle you." Landon didn't answer. Bear had stepped off the porch and now stood in the path between the man and the cabin door. Still no bark, just that quiet, immovable stance. "I'm with the Ranger Service," the man continued, lifting a laminated badge from his coat, just long enough for it to catch the weak light. "Name's Charles Fletcher. We're doing winter safety checks on old claims up here. Dangerous time for squatters." "I'm not squatting," Landon said flatly. His hand never left the handle of the knife he'd been sharpening. "Didn't say you were." The ranger's eyes flicked past him to the porch, to the smoke from the stove, to the newly repaired cabin walls. "Actually, looks like you've put some real work in here. You here alone?" Bear took one step forward. A soft rumble rolled from his chest. Fletcher stopped. "Easy there, boy. I like dogs." Bear didn't move. He didn't blink. "You planning to stay through winter?" Fletcher asked Landon, casually shifting his boot forward. Bear's lips lifted, not in full snarl, just enough for warning. And then, with sudden precision, he moved. Not a lunge, just a quick dart forward and a sharp nip at the man's pant leg. Not enough to draw blood, but enough to freeze Fletcher in place. Landon stepped down into the snow. "I think you should leave." "You trained that dog to do that?" Fletcher asked, brushing at the snow. "He trained himself," Landon replied. His eyes narrowed. "Why are you really here?" Fletcher raised his hands. "Hey, like I said, just checking properties. There've been break-ins, some weird stuff reported out here." Landon didn't move. "There's no one out here but animals, you know that?" Fletcher gave a short laugh. "Well, not entirely true, is it?" He glanced at the cabin again. "Kid like you, all the way out here, living alone. That's unusual. Makes people curious." Something in his tone set Landon on edge. Not the words themselves, but how they were delivered. Familiar, in a way he couldn't quite name. Fletcher's eyes caught the window beside the door, the one Landon had repaired with real glass just weeks ago. "Mind if I step inside? I've been out since dawn, just looking for a little warmth." Bear growled louder, this time deep and unrelenting. "No," Landon said. "We don't let strangers in." For a long moment, Fletcher said nothing. Then he shifted, pulled his glove tighter, and smiled without warmth. "Suit yourself, just trying to be neighborly." He turned to go, but not before his eyes lingered on the porch, just long enough to catch sight of the old photo Landon had forgotten to bring back inside, the one they'd found in the hidden room. A couple, black and white, smiling, Faded ink scrawled beneath. They thought no one would ever come this far. Fletcher froze. His eyes narrowed on the photo. Then, just as quickly, he turned away. "I'll be back," he said over his shoulder. "Maybe with someone who can help." Landon didn't respond. He stood there as the man's form receded into the white, his boot tracks swallowed up by snowfall. Bear remained motionless until the trees closed behind Fletcher like a curtain. Only then did he turn, step up onto the porch, and press his head gently against Landon's leg. Later that night, Landon took the old letter back out, the one from the hidden room. He hadn't read it in a while. He ran his finger under the closing line. "If you ever see Thomas again, don't believe what he says. Thomas Fletcher." His breath caught. The man at the gate wasn't just a stranger. He was part of this place's past, and maybe the reason it had stayed buried so long. Landon set the letter down slowly. Outside, Bear stood at the window, watching the woods. Quiet, still, ready. And for the first time, Landon truly understood what Bear had been doing all this time. Not barking at ghosts, guarding against something real. The smell came first. Not the familiar scent of wood smoke curling from the cabin stove, but a sharper, bitter tang, like burnt rubber and sap. Landon was stacking firewood when he paused, inhaling slowly. He turned toward the western ridge. Bear was already standing, ears up, nose twitching. "Smoke," Landon whispered. The sky above the trees shimmered with a strange yellow light. It wasn't sunset. By dusk, the smoke had thickened into a murky haze. Ash floated down in lazy spirals. A gust of wind carried the unmistakable crackle of burning timber, distant but steady. Landon climbed to his ridge lookout and scanned the horizon. In the far distance, a smear of orange crawled across the tree line like molten paint. "Wildfire," he muttered. Bear stood beside him, pressing close, eyes following Landon's. He dropped from the platform and started running. Down the slope, back to the cabin. Inside, he opened the emergency chest, dragging out what he'd long hoped he'd never need. Burlap sacks, old wool blankets, heavy gloves, and the 2 shovels he'd restored last fall. They had hours, maybe less. The wind picked up. "Come on," Landon said. "We're not leaving." He'd thought about that for a second. Just grab the emergency pack, head downhill, follow the riverbed out. But the moment passed. This was their home. They'd built it board by board, repaired every inch of it with their own hands. They weren't running. Not yet. He soaked the burlap in the water barrels, then climbed the ladder to the roof. Bear, despite his age, followed to the edge of the porch, watching, pacing. Landon shoveled leaves and debris from the eaves, then dragged the soaked sacks across the shingles. The water steamed in the rising heat. Back on the ground, he moved to the woodpile, tossing every log away from the house. Bear followed him, dragging smaller sticks with his teeth. When Landon stopped to catch his breath, Bear nudged a shovel toward his boot. "Yeah," Landon said, breathless. "I know." They dug a fire break in a wide arc around the cabin, scraping down to mineral soil. Shovelfuls of dirt flew in frantic bursts. Every few minutes, Landon paused to wipe smoke from his eyes. The air was growing thick. A dull orange glow pulsed through the trees now, too close. "We need water," he said. He grabbed the biggest pot and a canvas bag, and they ran to the stream, maybe 100 yards down the slope. Bear was ahead of him, leading through the dark, weaving trail. They filled containers as fast as they could, Bear dragging one back with the strap in his teeth while Landon carried the other. On their 3rd trip, Bear yelped. Landon spun around. The canvas bag had snagged on a branch, and Bear had twisted to free it. His back leg gave out and he crumpled, panting, eyes wide. Hey! No! Landon dropped to his knees beside him. Not now! Bear licked his hand, tried to rise, but couldn't put weight on the leg. Landon looked up the trail toward the cabin. The sky was orange now. Okay, he said. Okay, you stay here. I'll get the water. He ran. He hauled the pot, dumped it into the ground trench he'd dug, turned back, ran again. The fire hit the tree line at midnight. Landon stood in front of the cabin with a shovel in one hand and the soaked sack in the other. Embers rained like fireflies gone mad. The wind howled. Trees exploded in pillars of flame. He stomped out the first spark that landed near the porch. Then another. Then 10 more. The air was alive with heat and chaos. He saw a bush ignite 20 feet from the garden fence and sprinted, smothering it with the sack, then shoveling dirt over what remained. Back and forth, stamp, smother, breathe smoke. He didn't remember crying, but tears streaked down his face anyway. And then, Bear, limping, dragging the canvas bag in his jaws, one slow, determined step at a time. Bear! Landon ran to him, took the bag, dropped to his knees. Stubborn, loyal, ridiculous, old mutt, he whispered. Bear leaned against him, exhausted, his side heaving. Together they fought until the sky started to lighten. The fire passed in the early morning, shifting with the wind. The worst of it rolled north, leaving a blackened edge around the cabin clearing. The air was damp with ash and silence. Landon sat on the porch steps, Bear beside him, both of them caked in soot. The cabin still stood, singed, smoked, but whole. He touched Bear's fur, ran a hand gently down his flank. You kept us alive, he said. Again. Bear didn't lift his head, but his tail thumped weakly once against the step. Landon leaned back and looked out over the trees. What was left of them? They'd fought fire and won, not with gear or engines, but with grit and 2 beating hearts that refused to quit. The mountain wasn't done with them yet, and they weren't done with it. The wind through the trees didn't sound as wild anymore. Maybe it was the season, early autumn with its softer edges and thinning air. Or maybe it was Landon himself. At 16 he stood taller, not just in inches, but in the way he moved. The quiet certainty of someone who had already faced fire and been forged by it. The cabin had changed, too. It no longer looked like a ruin clinging to the side of the Appalachian slope. Now it had a proper roof, real glass in the windows, and a stone chimney that no longer leaned like it wanted to fall. There was even a second door on the north wall, opening to a tiny porch that overlooked the slope, where they'd first seen the smoke. What had once been a desperate shelter was now something closer to a home. And Landon wasn't building just for himself anymore. He adjusted the plank in his hands, checking the alignment against the new frame. The morning light caught the edge of the cedar board as he hammered it into place. Behind him the structure was taking shape slowly. A bunkhouse. Nothing fancy. 4 bunks, a table, a small wood stove, but solid, safe. It was for the others, for the ones like him, kids who had nowhere to go or who didn't want to be found. Not that he was broadcasting it. The people who needed it would find it the same way he had, by instinct, by desperation, by hope. Bear watched from the porch. The old dog didn't move as fast now. His back legs stiffened in the cold. His muzzle had gone nearly all grey, and his hearing wasn't what it used to be. But every night, without fail, Bear dragged himself to the front steps and lay down facing the trail. Guarding. Always guarding. Landon took breaks more often these days, mostly for Bear's sake. He walked over now with a tin dish of warm broth and set it down gently near his old friend. You don't have to keep doing this, you know, he said softly, crouching beside him. You earned your rest 10 times over. Bear gave no reply, just lifted his head, blinked slowly, and let out a soft puff of breath. He drank a little, then laid his head back, down. The porch creaked under Landon as he sat down next to him. They watched the woods together for a while. Nothing stirred except wind and the rustle of squirrels in the high branches. Landon reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of folded paper. It was weathered now, the corners soft, ink faded from years of handling. It was the unfinished letter they'd found in the hidden room. He'd read it too many times to count, trying to understand the voices of people long gone, the ones who thought the mountain could swallow their secrets forever. They thought no one would ever come this far, Landon whispered. But he had. And Bear, most of all, had known what lay beneath the soil, behind the silence. Bear hadn't barked for attention. He hadn't barked for food. He'd barked for the truth, even when Landon didn't want to hear it. He stood now, wiping his hands on his jeans, then walked over to the front post of the porch. The same one Bear had leaned against 100 times over the years. With slow, careful strokes, Landon used his pocket knife to carve into the wood. It took him nearly an hour. He didn't rush. When he stepped back, the morning light hit the letters just right. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. Landon ran his fingers over the carved words, then looked back at Bear. "Guess I had to grow into what you already knew." The dog shifted, one paw crossing over the other. His eyes remained fixed on the tree line. The rest of the day passed in steady rhythm, hammering, hauling, sawing. When dusk fell, Landon lit the lanterns and worked a bit more by their golden glow. He paused only when Bear let out a soft groan and pushed himself upright. The dog limped down the steps with deliberate slowness and walked with visible effort to the edge of the clearing. He turned and lay down just beside the trail, head up, ears still alert, though twitching slower now. The message was clear. Landon watched from the porch, his breath curling in the cooling air. "You still think someone's coming, don't you?" Bear blinked once. "Maybe you're right," Landon said. He stayed there until the stars came out, sitting in the porch chair he'd built himself. Bear didn't move. The cabin stood solid behind them. The bunkhouse was half done, and the mountains, scarred, burned, alive, rose quiet and endless around them. Tomorrow there'd be more work, more repairs. Maybe someone new would show up. Maybe not. But tonight, there was peace. And one last build wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something more. The trail that wound its way up the mountain had never been paved. It cut through trees like a scar, rough and narrow, its switchback softened only by time and footsteps. But on this autumn morning, it carried something new, the echo of young voices, laughter, and boots scuffing through leaves. They came in a rented van, 15 students from the high school down in Ridge Hollow. Juniors, mostly, notebooks in hand, windbreaker hoods flapping in the breeze. Their teacher, a wiry man named Mr. Carden, led the group with more enthusiasm than breath. "This," he announced, "is the place you've been reading about. Landon Ward's cabin, the boy who stayed." The group paused at the old wooden gate, where a sign hung from hand-welded iron hooks. The wood was split in places, but the lettering remained sharp. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. "Did he really live here alone?" one boy asked. "Not alone," a girl replied, pointing toward the porch. Bear lay there, same spot he'd claimed for nearly a decade. His face was nearly white now, grizzled and softened by time. One ear twitched at the sound of boots, but his eyes stayed half-closed. He didn't move. "He's alive?" someone whispered. Landon stepped out from behind the cabin. Taller now, broader, with a face that had sharpened into quiet strength. His hands were calloused, but steady. His voice was low and calm. Yeah, he's still here. The kids gathered closer, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. Landon didn't offer a speech. He wasn't the talking type. He pointed to the sign on the gate. "That's all you need to know," he said. "But what does it mean?" a small voice asked. It came from a girl near the back, maybe 14. She had thick glasses and a spiral-bound notebook hugged to her chest. She looked at Bear, then back at Landon. "Do dogs really know things?" she asked. "Like, before people do?" Landon walked slowly toward the porch and crouched beside Bear. He ran his hand along the old dog's back, feeling the shallow rise and fall of each breath. Bear didn't stir, but his tail thumped once, faint and steady. "Sometimes," Landon said, "they know things we don't want to see yet. Sometimes they know before we do." The girl smiled. Then, without a word, she opened her notebook and began to write. The group wandered the grounds, quietly, respectfully, taking notes, sketching the bunkhouse, tracing the carved initials on the porch beams. No one raised their voice. No one asked what had happened to the people before Landon. They didn't need to. The mountain carried enough silence for the answers. When the group left that afternoon, Landon remained by the gate. He watched them descend until the trees swallowed the trail again. Bear hadn't moved. He never did when strangers came. But as the last laugh faded into the wind, he opened one eye and looked at Landon. Still watching. Still guarding. Landon sat beside him, resting his back against the post. "You did good, old man," he murmured. "Better than most people ever do." The forest settled into dusk. A breeze rustled the branches above. Somewhere down in the hollow, a hawk called. Bear's eyes closed again, his breathing slow but even. He didn't need to stand anymore. He just needed to be there. Landon looked out over the land they had reclaimed. The fire scars had long since grown over. New saplings reached for the sky. The bunkhouse had welcomed 3 more runaways since spring. No questions asked, no names required. Only trust. And a dog to keep watch. Back on the porch, Landon took a pocket knife from his belt and began carving into a fresh piece of wood. Slowly, deliberately. He didn't bark for food. He barked for the truth. He set the board on the gate, just above the old one. Let it carry the message forward. Then he turned to the camera, still recording from the post he'd mounted last winter. If you've ever had a dog that saw something before you did, that stayed when others left, you get it. He looked at Bear. This story's not just mine. It's his. And maybe it's yours too. A pause. Tell us your story with a loyal dog. And if this one meant something to you, help keep it going. His voice softened. Support the channel. Share it with someone who still believes loyalty matters. He looked back to Bear one more time. Some truths bark before they're spoken. The wind shifted, and the dog at the gate did not move. But his presence said everything.